Well, loving where we are these few weeks together, we're talking about worship and the lifestyle of worship. And if you're new to Hope City, one of our primary values is worship. And it's the kind of people that we are. It's the kind of people that we're becoming. And I know this might be a weird conversation for some of you because you're like, yeah, worship is just the 1 hour activity or thing that we do on Sunday. And what I want to lay before you on the front end of this conversation is that worship is not the 1 hour, but worship really is every hour of every day of every week of our lives. And I would imagine most people in the Hope City orbit believe that. But, there are some people that are like, no, worship, if I had to define it, worship is the deal that we do, the activity from 9 to 10, 15, and 11 to 12, 15, and if the Spirit's really working, maybe we go to 10, 20, maybe 10, 25, but we don't want to interrupt lunch because things are going to get off the rails. And I think we can just say in concert that that's not really the worship we're talking about. We're not talking about worship that lasts 1 hour. We're talking about worship every hour of every day of every week of our life. And what I want to do as we talk about this, I want us to hold on to just a couple verses out of Hebrews chapter 13. So if you've got a copy of the scripture, I'd love for you to turn there. Let me just warn you, if you are new to church or new to the Bible, welcome. But Hebrews is like the hardest book to find in the New Testament. It's tucked right in between this book called Philemon and the book of James. I still have to use the table of contents to find it, so if you're having trouble finding it, no worries. Otherwise, you can look up on the screens with us. Here's what Hebrews 13, beginning with verse 15 says. It says, "Through him, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge or give thanks." It's one translation says, acknowledge his name. "Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." So usually when we have a few talks on worship, there's usually a few people that are like, "Oh, brother, I wish I would have known we were doing this series on worship because I wouldn't have come because I'm not a worshiper. Hello, I'm not a hand raiser. I'm not a singer. I'm not a kneeler. I'm not a shouter. I'm not an emotional extrovert. So worship is not really my bag." And what I would say, or I'll just go ahead and say it, what I will say if you're in that category, is that everybody on the planet, everybody in the room today is a worshiper. I mean, I think implicitly we know that, right? You get a little sliver, a little snapshot of your life or my life. There is going to be something that moves you, right? I mean, it could be as simple as, "Oh my goodness, honey, did you hear there's going to be an Office marathon on TNT this weekend? Oh my goodness, 48 hours of Dwight Schrute. It's going to be amazing." And your blood pressure goes up and you start planning and you start scheming, right? And what I would contend is that there's always going to be something in your life that you're willing to be inconvenienced for. Something that you're willing to move a mountain for. And what I would say is that's the thing that you're worshiping. And so worship isn't just 1 hour a week. Worship is the thing that we do every hour of every week. Let me say this a different way, and this is really how I began the series last weekend, but every human being is a worshiper. Every person on the planet is worshiping something. That's sort of the foundational idea of these 4 weeks together. We live and we move and we have our being for something. And yet the design of our soul is that we would worship, that we would adore, that we would discover that God is the greatest treasure in the universe. But if our adoration is not daily moving towards our Heavenly Father, then our adoration is going to lead and land us somewhere. And the reason is because, hello, you are a worshiper. And so what we're trying to remind ourselves of these few weeks together, and what we're really asking God to do, is to open our eyes. We want to see God. We want to see that he is the ultimate over all things. Because if our eyes are not open, guess what? We're just walking around blinded, giving our greatest affections to small things. And yet if our eyes are opened, as Psalm 34 says, if we've tasted and we've seen that he is good, that he is the best, that he is the ultimate, then all of a sudden worship becomes a reflex. It becomes a daily thing. It is an extravagant response back to him because of his extravagant grace poured out on our life. And that's the idea that we're going to do our best to hold on to today. I want to hold on to a couple ideas in particular around this text. The first idea is this, and you can jot this down if it's helpful for you. But the idea is that extravagant worship is only possible because of the doorway of Jesus. Now, I know that may sound like an elementary truth for some of you, but just because it was an early truth for you doesn't mean it's not a new truth for somebody, right? I mean, it's just a reminder, nobody graduates from a truth. We just grow into it, right? And so let me just say this idea again. Extravagant worship, which is what we're after. Extravagant worship is only possible because of the doorway of Jesus. This is what the writer of Hebrews is getting at. He says in verse 15, through him, Jesus, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. Okay, what does that mean? It means that if we're going to bring extravagant worship to God as a lifestyle, not just in here 1 hour a week, but as a lifestyle, if we're going to bring extravagant worship, which is a sacrifice of praise, then the only way to bring that kind of worship is through Jesus. That's what Jesus says. Jesus says, I'm the way. And he is the reason for our worship. And this is the reason, by the way, that people show up at this building. Literally before the crack of dawn on Sundays. They're putting out flags, signs, unlocking doors, holding crying babies. Not because they don't have other things to do, but because their eyes have been opened. They have tasted and seen that Jesus is the greatest thing to give their life to. And so gladly, they just pour out their life like a drink offering. And they're like, you know what? I'm going to live my life so that those on the outside can come on the inside. I mean, look 2 verses before this. Verse 12, he says, so Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Now, to the Jewish hearer, this would make a lot of sense because they're like, yeah, what the high priest does is he makes a sacrifice inside the temple, which is inside the city. And then he sprinkles the blood on the altar, and then they take the carcass of the animal and they discard it outside the city and they burn it. And the writer of Hebrews is like, yeah, this is what I'm talking about. Jesus was sacrificed outside the city. He laid his life down outside the city. Now, he was sentenced inside the city, tried inside the city, suffered inside the city, but he laid his life down outside the city for those inside the city. This is why Jesus is constantly referring to himself as like the perfect sacrifice. He's like, I am the perfect sacrifice. And I'm the perfect high priest. And I'm the gate. Meaning nobody gets to me. Nobody gets to God except through me. I'm the gate. So nobody gets into the city called the kingdom of God unless you come through this gate. That's idea number 1. Idea number 2 is closely connected, but I want you to hold both of these together. Second idea for us is that worship is also a weapon. Worship is also a weapon. Keep reading. It says, through him, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge, or again, your translation may say give thanks. Lips that acknowledge or give thanks his name. In other words, acknowledging, confessing, giving thanks to God in the middle of our darkest battles, it always puts us on the right side of victory. I mean, my mind goes to 2 Chronicles chapter 20, where Jehoshaphat is the king of Israel, and Israel has a long string of bad kings, more bad kings than good kings. Every once in a while they have a good king. Jehoshaphat was a good king. He was kind of a weenie, but he was also a good king. And Israel's in trouble. And what's happening is Moab and the Ammonites, they're coming against Israel, and their army is like 10 times the size of Israel. And so Israel knows that they're facing literal decimation. And so they cry out to God. And they're like, God, you got to save us. And so God responds. He sends a prophet, and the prophet comes. He says, God is going to be your victory, which I love that idea, that he's not like, I'm just going to give you victory. He's like, God's going to be your victory. And everybody takes this collective sigh of relief, and they're like, cool, going back to normal life, going back to work. And Jehoshaphat's like, no, not today. We're going to double down on this promise. If God is really going to be our victory, you know what we're going to do? We're going to show up with God. We're actually going to send our troops out on the theater of battle. We don't have to, because he just said he's going to be our victory, but we're going to show up on the battlefield anyway, our tiny little army against this massive army, and we're actually going to put our worship leaders at the front of the army, at which all the guitar players were like, didn't really sign up for that, but okay, I guess we're gonna do it. And so they go out on the theater of battle, and the worship leaders, they're singing. And to everybody else, they're like, this is gonna go bad. Israel is about to be destroyed, and yet the worship leaders, they're just singing these songs of God's faithfulness. They're like, we know God has come through for us. We know God will come through for us. We know God today is coming through for us. And at the end of the story, you can read it, God comes through for them. And my point is this, is that you and I have got to learn to inject worship into the darkest places of our life. We have to learn to inject worship into our anxiety, into our fear, into our depression, into the places of addiction. And the reason is that worship changes the atmosphere of our life. And I get it. I know people are like, you, me, we're like, I don't have anything left to give. Because when you're in your darkest moment, you're like, I don't have it. I don't have anything. And it's just an opportunity for you and I to remind ourselves that Jesus is bigger. Jesus is more. Jesus has resources that we're not aware of. We're like, I don't have the feelings. I don't feel like worshiping. And I'm just like, thank God for Spotify then. Right? Because there is a song of praise right now being sung somewhere. And you and I, all we have to do is just find the playlist and have the courage to press play. Because in that moment, worship, it doesn't have to be our worship, but we can join our soul with worship that's happening, proclaiming the reality of God's kingdom and his power over every situation, and things begin to change. You know why? Because worship is a weapon. Now, don't muddy the waters and be like, well, what kind of worship? Are we talking about band worship or choir worship? Are we talking about guitars? Or listen, that's a dumb question. I don't think you're asking that question, but there are people that ask that question. What we're talking about is you and I in our darkest moments with all that we have, just putting the cross in the preeminent place and putting the power of the resurrection in the center of our darkest moments. Because when that happens, worship becomes possible. And freedom becomes available. This is why we started this conversation by saying worship isn't just 1 hour. It's not the thing that we do from 9 to 10:15 or 11 to 12:15. We're like, no. Worship isn't just 1 hour. Worship is every hour. Meaning, if you're waiting to worship, or if you're waiting to worship before you come through these doors, then you're not really understanding this conversation. Because what happens is we have to first come through the door, who is Jesus. And then we come through these doors, right? If you're only coming to worship as you come through these doors, then you're going to depend on these people to stir up a heart and a spirit of worship. But we don't have it in us to stir up a heart and a spirit of worship. And so what happens is if you are walking through the door of Jesus all week, and then you walk through these doors on Sunday, you are already saturated in worship. Let me say it a different way, and we're going to turn the corner. When we come into a place like this, make no mistake, we are coming to worship. I'm not trying to dismantle this thing that we've been doing for 2,000 years. We're coming together to worship. But when we leave here, we're going to worship. That may be a new idea for some of you. We're coming to worship, but we're leaving to worship. So for example, if you're going to a game at Bryant-Denny Stadium, and I know some of you went to the pretend game yesterday, but if you're going to a real game at Bryant-Denny Stadium, I think we all know this, like worship, before you ever step into Bryant-Denny Stadium, worship has saturated our entire city. Before you ever step into Bryant-Denny Stadium, you're walking down Hackberry, you take a left onto University Boulevard, you're seeing people painted head to toe in crimson and white. People are going crazy with the shakers. People are arguing on what's going to be the offensive strategy this year, who's going to be the starting quarterback. I mean, there's not even an official on the field yet. No plays happened. No route, no interception. The game hasn't even started. But when the game does start and the kickoff happens, it goes off like a bomb. You know why? Because for you, the game technically started at Saturday at 2, but really in your heart, the game started the previous Monday. Because that's when you got the ticket. You're like, I got a ticket. Unbelievable. Tuesday, you're like, did I tell you I got a ticket? I'm going to the game. Oh, man. So lucky I got a ticket. Wednesday, you're like, hey, did I tell you I'm going to the game? My ticket, I'm sitting in seat, well, section D, row 23. That's my favorite number. It's an omen. It's going to be an amazing day for me. Thursday, that's when you start planning, calling, scheming. You're like, can you keep our kids? We've had a death in the family. We're going to be going all day. We're going to the game. And you're like, where are we going to park? And are we going to tailgate? And do we have an extra $1,000 for the concession stand? And then Friday, what are you doing? You're doing the pre-tailgate deal at your house with your friends and your family. You're reliving the glory days of 1992, that national championship. You're arguing with your idiot Auburn neighbor. And then by the time you step into Bryant-Denny Stadium on Saturday at 2 p.m., you're like, this is epic. This is communal. This is the thing I am made for. This is the greatest sporting event in college history. And then when the ball is kicked off, it goes off like a bomb. You know why? Because worship's been happening all week. I'd love to say that's what happens in church. Wouldn't that be amazing if that's what happened in church? What happens in church typically, because I've been doing this a while, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about other people today, okay? But, typically what happens is Sunday morning rolls around, we're like, is it Sunday? Oh, it's Sunday today. And then there's some questions that begin to proceed out of that realization that it's Sunday. And the questions are things like, are we going to church today? I don't know. Are we going to church? I know it's pretty sunny out. We could go to the lake today. Well, what about the kids? Well, the kids, I guess, need church. I guess we should go to church. Okay, let's try to go to church. What time's it start again? Because I know they had 3 gatherings on Easter, and I don't know, do they have 2? It's been a while since we've gone, so let's just check the website. Okay, do we still want to go? Because it now seems like a lot of work, okay? Then we get the kids up, you get them dressed, they're arguing, and then one of, the couples, or if you're single, you're just having this conversation with yourself, you're just like, do we want to go to church? I mean, they have it online. There's one camera. It's not great production value, but we can at least tell people we watched, right? I think there's 8 people that watch on a regular Sunday, so we can be one of those 8. We can bump up the numbers to 9. Unbelievable. We are helping their statistics. No, let's go in person. Jesus, we want him to be proud of us. And so let's get in the car, get the kids dressed. We're going to do the deal. And then you're halfway to church and the kids are crying. Somebody pees their pants. You're screaming. You're arguing. And then you just double down on the question. Are we sure we want to go today? Maybe this is not the best day to go today. And then you pull into the parking lot. And if you're coming for the 11 is kind of crowded. And so you're like, where are we going to park? Are we going to have to park at the end of that gravel parking lot again? And it's sort of raining. Are we sure we want to do this? We got to check the kids in. I don't even like our kids at this point. Are we sure we want to go to church? And then you walk in to the auditorium, And after the countdown video, the band begins to play, and immediately you're like, I don't like this song. I told you 2 weeks ago, if they play this song again, I'm walking out. Hate that song. And then you get through worship, get through the musical part, and you're like, C-, didn't really love it. Didn't love worship today. Did not go off like a bomb. It went off like a wet blanket. And what I would say, if I can just give you a little pastoral correction, and this is directed at me as well, is the reason is because Jesus is not the treasure of our life. I'm not saying Jesus doesn't love us and he's for us and he makes a way for us and includes us and is tender towards us. But we're not talking about Jesus, we're talking about us. Our hearts are not singularly devoted to Jesus. And so what would happen today if God pulled the curtain back and we saw the landscape and the breadth and the width and the height and the depth of all that the gospel is. Not just the theological realities of his life, his death, his resurrection. I'm going to believe, I'm going to go to heaven, let's move on. But if we realize that Jesus' present reality, his kingdom, his purposes over my life will wake me up from my slumber. And I'll be alive and worshiping every hour. Because my devotion is tied to my joy. But that's got to be a supernatural work. I was reading an article by Tim Keller, one of the guys that helped shape me, pastor of New York City, and he was writing recently about the Asbury revival. It's finished, and he was talking about the history of revivals, and he says, one of the first marks of a true revival is that Christians, quotation, Christians get converted. And he makes the point, he's like, there's lots and lots of people that come into church and they're not actually converted, if I can use that word. They don't actually know Jesus. And they know a lot about Jesus. They're going to take forgiveness, because nobody wants to not be forgiven. They're going to take the hope of not going to hell, because nobody wants to go to hell. They're going to take the fact that maybe he's a healer, because nobody wants to be sick. And depending on where, what church you go to, they're going to take some of the health and the wealth, if that's what's being offered, because they're like, yeah, nobody wants to be poor and sick. But when it comes to Jesus being the treasure, the centerpiece, the king, the Lord, the one calling the shots, didn't really sign up for that. But this is the misunderstanding, because when Jesus says, I want to be the king, I want to be the Lord, I want to be the one calling the shots, it's you and I coming to the conclusion that we're the worst God we could ever have. We do not have our best interests at heart. And when we say yes to him as Lord, as King, as the one that is worthy of every moment, every hour of worship that we can give him, we recognize that our deepest joy is tied to that. And so what I want to do, I want to give you an opportunity today. We do this every few weeks where we just say we're not under the illusion that just because you show up to church, show up to a building, that you know Jesus. And there's no condemnation in that. If somebody was like, John, do you know Michael Jordan? And I was like, I don't know. I've heard of Michael Jordan, but if I was like, but I've never met Michael Jordan, nobody's going to be like, shame on you. And so no shame today if you're like, I've been around Jesus my entire life, but I don't know Jesus. There's no shame in that. But you don't have to leave this room still not knowing Jesus. Learning to treasure him up above all things. Because here's the thing, you don't have to be a Christian to not know this truth. Everybody in the room knows that you can get everything you want, and when it's all said and done, you'll be like, it was just okay. You can get all the money you thought you wanted, and you're like, didn't satisfy. You can marry the person you thought that was going to make you happiest, and it's not really going to satisfy. You can get the job you're shooting for, it's not going to satisfy. Only Jesus satisfies us in the deepest places of our life. And that's the invitation today. It's not an invitation to worship. You're already going to worship something. It's an invitation for you to direct your worship where joy will be the result.